Welcome to All in Tech's community events on the future of generative AI. Thank you for coming today. I know it's pouring outside. It's a Monday, and you still made it here. So thank you to everyone who's online and here in person. Thank you very much. I am Cora Mulviselli. I'll be your moderator today. I'm also the founder of All in Tech Global. We are a B2B AI-powered solution that works with companies to help with upskilling and training. We throw these community events because we want to ensure that we create a forum for diverse leaders, and it's a way to ensure that diverse leaders have input in current discourse as well. I started off in policies. I worked on international trade policy. I then made my way into tech as a product person, built B2B and B2C digital apps. Worked at Accenture's Innovation Lab, where I worked on different levels of emerging tech, including AI, a lot of text-based ML models that leveraged natural language processing, NLPs. On that topic, how many of you in the room have used Dolly? And do you use it regularly? An average daily? No? Okay, all right, so you've used it, you don't use it daily. What about ChatGPT? How many of you use ChatGPT? All right, quite a lot more fans with the text-based models. And do you use it daily? All right, a lot more daily users, even on the panel. And do you trust it? Okay, a couple of people trusting it. I'm not surprised. ChatGPT broke records. When they went live, they had over 1 million users in 5 days. That was a record for sure. I don't think any company had reached those levels. And these LLMs, these large language models, or as you can call them, generative AI, are quite powerful. ChatGPT 4, which recently was launched, it scored 150 more points on the SAT score than its predecessor, ChatGPT 3, which I believe was released, I think, back in 2020. So we've seen these major advancements. We've moved away from AI, ML models being able to simply perceive and classify to really generate, right? Create content that is very human-like, and also at the same time being sometimes indistinguishable from human. Have we passed that Turing test? I think that's a question. I think there's definitely some elements that have. And that brings us to why we're here today, because we're here to uncover some of this. We're here to talk about what is generative AI, what are the applications in industry on the future of work, and have some of these dialogues with our amazing expert panel. I'll start with you, Daniel. Daniel's the Chief AI Officer at WPP, and he's the CEO of Satalia. In 2007, founded Satalia. It's a provider of AI products and solutions. And in 2021, just a couple of years ago, the world's largest marketing company, WPP, bought Satalia. And you're also concurrently the Chief AI Officer there. And your background is you hold a master's and a doctorate in AI from UCL. We have Rick Howe. He's a partner at Speed Invest. He leads and manages the firm's investment thesis in all deep tech sectors, which includes AI as well as quantum technology. He's an ex-principal at IQ Capital, where you also sourced and led investment deals early stage in the deep tech startups. And your background is you have a Master's of Science in Computer Science from Edinburgh University and an MBA at Imperial. Not too far from here. We have Saurabh Johri. He's the chief scientist at Babylon. You oversee Babylon's AI initiatives, really disrupting how we receive medical care. You are a postdoctoral researcher at MRC Center for Outbreak Analysis and Modeling. That was at Imperial, and I backed by the Gates Foundation as well. You're currently sitting on the WHO, the World Health Organization's Artificial Intelligence for Health Focus Group. We have Lee Baz Sanchez. He's the HR director at EQT Group. EQT is one of the largest global investment organizations. You're also ex-McKinsey. You worked there for over a decade. You were embedded in their people and organization practice. You hold a degree in psychology from the University of Western Australia, but you don't have an accent that's Australian. Didn't notice that.
I've just tried to calm it down so people can understand me. It's there, especially after a few more beers.
That's good to know. I want to move on to the fun part, which is the question for your panel. This is a graph. It's by Goldman Sachs. They recently came out with some research which shows that about 2/3 of US occupations will be exposed to AI automation, and up to 50% of their workload could be replaced. And globally, what their research predicts is about 300 million people will be exposed to some level of AI automation. This is by OpenAI. They recently came out with some research. They have a different view. They believe there'll be around 80% exposure to current occupations. And here on this chart, we see the different industries that have exposure to LLMs or generative AI. I'll save you on on getting a microscope. Really read this visual. The stuff on the top, the greatest exposure are the more technical jobs and occupations. And the more labor elements are at the bottom. So think of like a cook, they have less exposure. Which brings me to our first question. Lee, this is for you. What is the impact of the future work?
Great question. I think it's interesting to talk about it from yes, that chart's kind of terrifying in terms of, and the Goldman report's terrifying in terms of they equate, greater than 50% of tasks automated as that job going away. I think we need to remember as we do this that it's similar to the return to work argument, is that most people actually had to go to work during COVID or have to go to work and they don't have the luxury of working from home. So I think there is knowledge workers are not actually freaking out, which they kind of should, if we believe this research. I think we should remember that there's a bunch of occupations that this won't affect nearly to the greatest extent. And there will be the AI doing some of your tasks, but your job won't effectively vanish. And the number of jobs that vanish, I think, is, to be seen. So a bit of a non-answer there.
I think you're right. We don't really know the adoption rate. Daniel, do you have a comment on this?
So a very good friend of mine coined the term the economic singularity, which is a point in time where we automate the majority of human labor. It's Callum Chase. And I think my personal opinion is over the next 10 years, we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of innovations being built using these technologies, loads of jobs being created, some being disrupted. I think anybody that believes they know what will happen after 10 years doesn't know what they're talking about. I think you use the word terrifying, but there's a school of thought that we should be automating as much as possible. If you can automate the production of food, healthcare, education, energy, if you can remove the friction from the creation and dissemination of those goods, you bring the cost down to very cheap. In some respects, you can bring the cost down to free. So why shouldn't we be trying to create a world where people don't have to work to feed themselves, but they can figure out how to contribute to society? I bet if I asked you all, what would you do if you didn't have to work? You'd say, I'll travel or indulge in my hobbies. And if I keep pressing you, you'll say, I want to contribute positively to humanity. And I think that we all have an innate desire to want to contribute positively to humanity. I think a lot of people around the world are constrained by their economics, and I want to free as many people as possible. I know lots of people that don't have to work. In theory, I don't have to work, but I'm working harder now than I ever have. I actually think we should be creating a world of abundance by automating as much as possible, freeing people up to do whatever they want.
That's very idealistic. In a very utopian world. What do the skills of the future look like? What skills do we, up until a few months ago, people were trying to learn how to code and people were telling their kids to go learn how to code. And we were trying to encourage that. Is that still something we should be doing?
I think people should figure out what they enjoy. I think it's very hard to predict what's going to be valuable in the future. I think figure out what you enjoy, try and pursue that. I used to say that orchestration was a very important skill, whether you're orchestrating complex systems to design new things or trying to orchestrate people to try and get them to follow you. So orchestration was a superpower. I think you just do what you think you enjoy and see what the world will look like in 5 years' time.
Anyone else want to jump in there?
Yeah. Do you want to? So I think that's a very kind of economics focused answer in terms of we want to automate as much as possible, and I hear it, but it is a very kind of economic focused view of the world. And the question would be, well, what would one do with all of that time and energy? What would one invest in? So I haven't really thought through that piece of it. But in terms of the skills of the future, I think what we're looking for is creative people. We're looking for people who think in frameworks so that we can coordinate those creative tasks together. So for instance, one of the things which but I've been thinking about when I speak to my teams is, well, look, do we actually need the size of the team we've got, given how powerful some of these systems are? These systems are essentially, technically function approximators. So they need to solve a task and they're very good at solving those tasks. So how do you think about a system, an orchestrated system where you are chaining together individual units of work so that actually the person overseeing that orchestration is the creative expert in the room? So I think there's some value to that orchestration argument.
I should say that I'm all about unlocking creativity, right? It's not about the WBP's trying to figure out how do you unlock the creative capacity of people. It's not an economic view, it's a humane view. I want to have more and more people free from constraints so that they can figure out how they contribute to humanity.
Rick, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, so we look slightly different perspective. We look at basically the company perspective and the people perspective. So eventually, all those new technology eventually will update and change the process within the company. And after that, then you look at what kind of skill set that people need to adapt under this new process. Like, for example, all those foundation model or large language model we're talking about every day, that could potentially change the way how data science or engineer work on building a model. So after that, then you look at how people, after the process being updated by those new technology, then you look at how people should react on those process. That's the way we look at the future of work.
Okay. Is there a consensus that human skills are pretty important right now, or will continue to become more important?
I do agree. I think automation is definitely one of the key things.
The one thing that AI can't do yet until we build super intelligence or whatever it is create the intent. The AIs or these technologies are trying to achieve the intent that the human creates. And I think it's still up to the human to figure out what is it that we're trying to achieve. So yes, there is a role for human beings.
Yeah, and coordinating humans to get to that intent is actually a pretty difficult thing to do.
I think, so an AI model, particularly a large language model, is very good at learning from data knowledge, but there's a completely different kind of quality of humans to create knowledge. And that's really, the process of conducting scientific research, investigation. That is a completely different endeavor. So I think, again, there's creativity in there in that kind of respect. But I think people conflate this idea of large language models, which embed a lot of data. And that's separate from creating knowledge about the world. That's a completely separate task. And so I think people should be cognizant of that view.
I think they do create knowledge though in some cases. So they create, there's a concept called semantic inference. So if I say to you, Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, we can infer that Socrates is mortal. That's creating new knowledge, and you can start to see these technologies starting to do that. And actually humans are quite limited at that ability. And I think these language models will also be limited at that type of reasoning ability. But I think they do create, I asked ChatGPT what it knew about me, and it said that I was a drummer in a band, which I'm not. And maybe it's a premonition, maybe it was predicting that would happen, but it was just making it up. That is creating something that hasn't existed before.
Whether it's new, verifiable, or useful knowledge, it's a separate kind of concern here. It's, how can we rely on the knowledge created by such a system? I think up until now, we're only, or for the foreseeable future, we'll be, hopefully, I think, trying to rely on knowledge created through a robust process of scientific research. And the scientific principles are the ones which we rely on for that creation of knowledge to solve, possibly the larger scale challenges which we have. But I think those larger scale challenges will be augmented by these AI technologies, which will be tools to facilitate.
Will that enable us to trust these machines more so than we do now? Because right now we can't fully trust them. There's also the hallucination effect as well.
Yeah. So was that me or was that an echo? So we kind of mentioned semantic inference, and that's completely true. what we need to think about, and it goes back to this idea of distinguishing inference from data versus how do you ground that inference from data, which is the output from your model, from fundamental knowledge. So how do you verify and fact check the outputs based on some knowledge which we know has been discovered through robust scientific process, which has had experimentation on it, which has had randomized controls run over it. That is a very kind of separate kind of task. So I think trust there's actually a number of kind of recent innovations which point to some level of trust. Trust is really a function of many different kind of properties of a model. One of those being the explanatory power of a model. Can we explain the outcomes of such a model? And we were talking earlier about our backgrounds in kind of probabilistic reasoning. That is an area which kind of gives that trust. It's an area which allows us some level of trust in a model. Can we actually understand the core principles of a generative model? These generative models which we see today are not causal generative models. In other words, we do not understand the true makeup of what is generating that data. They are purely generative models learned from patterns in data. So there is a trust aspect which needs to be overcome.
I think he explained from probably technology or scientific view. From application perspective, so basically there are two types of use case. We say high affordability use case and low affordability use case. The high one is basically the accuracy and is very important. So like, for example, in medical devices or kind of like very industry that need very, very high accurate result. Therefore, you still cannot fully trust. You still need human to involve to give feedback to basically to increase the trust between the AI and our result. But for some, like for example, text summarization, which the accuracy is not that super important in that case, actually there's more trust. I feel people use it. That's one of the reasons. If you ask really at the moment, the real, whatever you call ChatGPT or those large language models application area, majority of them still in consumer-based application or something that is not critical for the industry yet. And for the most important, actually some critical infrastructure level stuff, people still not using it heavily.
I think it's not really fair to use the, black and white, do we trust them or not? There are some things that they're good at and some things that they're bad at. If I ask DALL-E to create an image, it's not that I don't trust the image, it's whether it's good or bad. And these things are good at certain types of things and not good at others. And I suspect over the coming years they're going to get better at most things. And the challenge is understanding how confident it is in terms of its response. And I suspect that these companies will provide a confidence level with that response soon.
And what can companies do to prepare for this disruption? And what are they doing now?
So I'm happy to talk about kind of what I've seen. So the notion of automation's been around for a little while. I think there's lots of discussions around how to have kind of skill-based organizations. So understanding what skill pools there are in the organization and how to deploy those skills versus kind of titles or thinking through it in that way. And then you can get to the point where you're kind of, are we redeploying skills? Are we reskilling those individuals, or are we upskilling them based on the kind of needs and where we're going? I think the current state is that's just like exploded in speed. And I think that the pace and timing of those changes and what you can do to affect those, I think is really important. And in terms of a micro level, I think there's a lot of organizations that are like, we have a red team, just like we're pulling a kind of multidiscipline team together to just look at everything we do and how this is going to change that. And we've had that in a couple of kind of our portfolio companies and even internally when we think about a technology team, speaking from the HR perspective, we've got a kind of hackathon tomorrow to go through like everything that could change. And I think that change is important from yes, there is the work that I do in my role, and that's really kind of scary and interesting and exciting depending on your point of view. But like all my suppliers are also going to be disrupted. So we were talking about learning and development, but we have a very good one that is a kind of AI-centric one. If we didn't, we'd probably go look for another supplier. So there's like impact on that side. Then our customers are going to get disrupted as well. And then as we think about our organization, there's kind of business processes, but how we think about innovation, how we think about other things. so it is just like, I think the fascinating thing is just like, it's such a multifaceted problem from like a business perspective that you kind of end up spinning around in circles. I think the multidisciplinary notion of this, I think it's something that's come through kind of in the last 5-10 years, is how do we get multidisciplinary teams? So if we want to fix something, we need someone from legal to make sure that we're thinking about those implications, but we also need, you know, a bunch of developers, a bunch of architects, and also some business leaders and HR to like kind of put that together in a way that makes sense. And leading a multidisciplinary team is incredibly difficult and requires real skills. And you need to build those skills. Coming back to like our first point about leading humans is difficult because they can think.
So it's at the early stages, the strategic overview, trying to understand where is the impact and to better understand what can be done about it and how does that impact the organization and tools you use and the talent that you have in your workforce you need now and tomorrow.
Yeah, so I think there's like the kind of, at the moment, there's like a ton of stories within kind of our portfolio and elsewhere where it's like, holy shit, I've been playing with this thing for 7 hours and it like actually works and is pretty good. And then like, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our customers? There's a great example I listened to the other day of like, you know, a customer service chatbot. And you're like, if we get really good at this, we're not just like, we essentially like automating our customers. So then there's like, okay, we have to go further down the value chain a little bit. It's like, well, how the hell do we do that? Like, I don't know. Like, we should probably get some people to think about that. So it's like very interesting from that point of view, but also I think to the earlier point of like, if anyone knows what's happening in 5 or 10 years, they're dreaming. I think it's a little bit of how do we get a handle on the now, and it's just going to kind of continue to change.
Daniel, you work with,
I think organizations know that they need to be able to adapt quickly to a changing world. And I have a very specific definition on intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. The keyword is adaptive. And so organizations know that they need to be able to innovate to be able to adapt to a changing world. And the question is, how do you innovate? And there's a very good book by a guy called Dan Pink on how to motivate people to innovate. So there are 3, giving people the freedom to do what they want, giving them the ability to become really good at what they want, and then giving them the purpose. When my company was born, which is actually born 15 years ago in LBS, over the past 15 years, we've never had any fixed hierarchies, fixed managers. People have always been free to work where they want, however they want, wherever they want. And I'm a big fan of what is now being called liquid organizations. So going back to your idea of not allocating people based on roles, but allocating people based on the plethora of skills that they have is how organizations need to adapt. There are 2 problems in this, multiple problems in this space. So my company builds workforce solutions for companies. The first challenge is that organizations don't know what supply they have. They don't know what skills people have. They don't know what, even number of employees that they have in some companies. They also find it very difficult to understand what work they need to be allocated to. So there's a first challenge, which is understanding what skills people have and understanding then what is required. That's still a big problem. And just, this might sound a bit creepy, but one of the things that we do is we build digital twins of each employee. So we will take all of your data and build a digital representation, a digital brain of you. And then I should use a better word than interrogate, but we interrogate that twin. We query that twin and say, if we put you in this team, will you work well? If you work on this project, will you be developing your skills and thrive in your career? So we can use essentially a model to understand how people will react in certain situations. That's one of the first challenges. The second challenge is then, how do you allocate people to work? And so if I've got 5 people that I need to allocate jobs, there are 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. There's 120 possible ways I could allocate those 5 people to 5 jobs. If I've got 15 people to allocate to 15 jobs, I have 1 trillion ways, 15 times 14 times this. Just to expect a human to solve that problem of wasting our time. If you've got 60 people to allocate to 60 jobs, there are more possible combinations than there are atoms in the universe. If you like, AI can be used to allocate people to work in an incredibly more effective way than human beings. And also it can understand people and their preferences and their hopes and dreams and desires better than HR and better than their managers. And the challenge is, how do you combine all of those things I've just mentioned to create liquid organizations, to enable organizations to adapt quickly to a changing world? And I'm, if you're starting companies, you'll probably start a product company that will be structured in one way. If you're A service company will be structured in another way. The challenge is how do you create an operating system for a company that enables for innovations to be taken to market using one structure or another structure or another structure? How do you create an operating system that enables the right structure to emerge according to the innovation you're taking to market and not just wedding yourself to one structure? And that means rethinking how an organization operates. Not having traditional hierarchies is a good start.
Probably on my side, slightly different from an investor perspective is I probably look at this issue from two perspectives. Firstly, startup world, and secondly is established large enterprise. One interesting fact I want to share is last 3 months, we've been engaged by lots of our LP. So the LP are basically the investor into the VC fund. Most of them are quite large enterprise. Suddenly they all engage us saying, hey, tell us how can we use ChatGPT and what are the use cases? So we can clearly see on the market side, there are lots of demand from those large enterprise. But one thing we feel is quite frustrating for us is, I think rather than just taking the hype to use it, you probably want to really think about, is this really some demand for using this type of whatever large language model to solve your business problem, rather than just taking the hype, in order to implement it. However, this is really good thing on the startup side. So if you're really working on the startup side, particularly on the early stage, normally it's quite hard to engage with large enterprise. I invested in a generative AI company like 2.5 years ago, doing something traditional GAN. And the thing is, no one asked about this company. And when this company engaged with customer, no one understands generative AI. It's just so hard for them to engage with customer. But look at now, if you say you are building a generative AI platform, those large enterprise doesn't even care what you are really building. They just say, okay, come on, let's do a POC and then quickly move things forward. So I was saying is you should really think about from your perspective, how you take advantage actually to move forward on your business side.
Okay. And Sarah, I know the way that Babylon is applying generative AI is pretty innovative. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing? Can you share some of those use cases with us?
I'll share them in an abstract sense so that I'm not sharing any kind of insider information.
We won't extract that.
Yeah. So we've been looking at generative models for some time. I should say, and I think most of you will appreciate, generative AI hasn't just emerged out of nowhere, right? It's been around for a while. The idea of generative models themselves have been around for decades. It's really about how do you construct a model and allow that model to generate new outcome, which is believable. What's really changed here is some innovations back in 2018 and more recently in 2022 with certain kind of types of deep neural networks, so-called transformer models is really what we're talking about here. And then more kind of recent ones are so-called diffusion models. What's happened here is that those models allow us to really kind of compress more information and then factor in kind of elements of time and give us this kind of view on what's relevant in order to develop those models. So that's it at a high level. How we use those models is really, I think about it in 3 different levels. We can use those models out of the box and we can use the capabilities or the properties of those models to do what these kind of AI models are very good at, these large language models are very good at. And I'm talking specifically about language models as opposed to kind of diffusion models such as DALL-E 2, because I come from a world which we look at data in healthcare, which is very much dominated by text. So we're focused on large language models mostly. So think about it in 3 different levels. How do we use these models out of the box? So we've already mentioned some of these use cases, such as summarization. So we have large volumes of clinical records. How do we summarize those? How do we summarize those into a format which allows us to automate the summarization of a clinical consultation? So, if you're a doctor and I'm the patient and we're having this conversation, there is a huge amount of an administrative burden involved in typing up that note. And I'm not sure who of you are from medical backgrounds, but if you go to your doctor's surgery and you look at the systems which those folks have in place, it's really pretty old-fashioned, pretty arcane. So what we see is when we start to embed these types of approaches to solve problems which our clinicians have, it's a game changer. It changes the efficiency in terms of the number of consultations which the doctors can have per hour. That's, useful in and of itself. Then there are, again, kind of this level 1 type of application of large language models, which is how do we take content which we get from, information relating to a patient leaflet. So let's say I'm a diabetic patient, and Babylon has created a lot of information about diabetes, how an individual should manage their care plan. How do we rapidly adjust that so that it's actually transferred to patients in other populations? For instance, their reading age may not be at the level which we might be tailoring it for folks in central London. We kind of deliver care for populations in rural parts of the United States, very socially deprived communities. So how do we adapt content using this kind of notion of style transfer? Then how do we do things such as question answering over content? So giving members, we talk about our patients as members. How do we give members access to all of the information they want? That's not something which is currently in production, but that is that is on our roadmaps. And then it's kind of level 2 and level 3 use cases. So level 2 use cases, this is my own hierarchy, by the way, so, just making up on the fly. Level 2 is almost how do we think about using these large language models together with other AI systems? And so we spoke already about how would we use a large language model verified with clinical knowledge. So that is something which we're very much focused on. So we've already spoken about it. We can't necessarily trust these systems 100%, but one notion of trust is how do we ensure that we can use medical knowledge, which has been codified over the decades, to ensure that we've got a grounding in what is correct about the outcome which is driven. That's one example of a kind of second layer kind of generative AI system. And the third layer, which is really where all the action is at, which is really something which has kind of happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That's the speed at which the space is kind of innovating, is this idea of autonomous large language models, or something called AutoGPT. So how do you create a system, give it a set of prompts, so it's actually semi-autonomously trying to deliver or achieve upon some objective? An example might be, hey, create me an optimal strategy for marketing to all of the patients in a particular population. The model itself has access to information on the internet, and it will go and find specific bits of information, come back, and then create strategies. That's very kind of bleeding edge type of work, but that kind of gives you an indication of the levels that we can be thinking about in terms of applying AI. I think most people are still thinking about, hey, I'm going to use ChatGPT to create some content for me in industry. And I think for those people who are really playing these models and pushing them as hard as they can, we're over that. Now it's how do we really start to chain these models together to create something really compelling? And that's coming back to this idea of, what should we be thinking about in the future of work? I think about it as having creative polyglots. So how do you get creative people to chain these ideas together to deliver something truly innovative?
Just maybe a quick question for you as well. I want to understand it more because I saw quite a lot of interesting use case you mentioned, which I see the benefit and the use case. What about the people really in the industry? Do they really accept this kind of new change because it's involved lots of their existing workflow change? Are they open-minded, particularly in your industry? I think people used to do a certain way and they are really reluctant actually to adopt the new things.
That's a great question. I think we have a very progressive workforce. We have a very progressive group of clinicians who want to embrace technology. And so they're very, they want to be part of this innovation. Of course, they're also grounded in that training of clinical knowledge. Everything must be evidence-based. Everything must be kind of derived from kind of robust scientific knowledge. That's why we focus so much on combining these systems together with evidence and knowledge. It's a functional kind of outcome of the technology, but it's also something which helps support and understand for those clinicians who are leveraging this technology to actually understand what's happening under the hood.
Got it.
what you described, is that on the trajectory of achieving a super, what, we just lost the script, and artificial general intelligence? Is that a super intelligent machine?
So I
Is
did
that, are we moving then towards a super intelligent machine, an AG?
That's a very big question. I think this notion that we're close to AGI, I mean, I'm probably outside of my comfort zone here. I think most people, if you ask this question, probably are outside of their comfort zones because nobody really understands what we mean by an AGI. You know, what I kind of defined it earlier, that's one kind of axis of that definition, is the ability to create knowledge and then reason over that new knowledge. So that's kind of, you know, potentially one narrow definition of it. I think we're very far away. I think these systems are essentially statistical learning systems, which are playing at intelligence in a fairly convincing way in some cases, but they are not truly intelligent. They're doing first or second order reasoning. There is no kind of higher level reasoning going on here. And that's why I keep referring back to, and Daniel mentioned it as well, with this kind of idea of semantics. Can you actually leverage knowledge and then semantics over that knowledge to do multiple forms of reasoning? Not just, I forget which way around it goes now, but Daniel Kahneman has, you know, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, two forms of knowledge, two forms of intelligence, really. System one, which is rapid, which is based off of instantaneous, okay, that's really largely data-driven. And then system two, which is the ability to actually do reasoning, to think through the process, is slower. And so these systems are really kind of biased in one of those domains.
Okay.
And system one is way more susceptible to doing stuff wrong.
I was very privileged to speak to Sam Altman a few years ago, and we were talking about GPT-4 and its impact on society. And I don't think anybody believed the impact it was going to have, nor did he. He thinks it will achieve AGI by the end of the decade. And most of the people, most of the scholars in this space now are thinking it might happen even sooner. But actually, going back to your point, AGI is it's an ambiguous definition. So, you know, what is general intelligence? At the moment, you've probably got in your pocket a machine that's pretty good graduate at almost everything, albeit somewhat intoxicated sometimes. Maybe in a year's time, you'll have a master's level with reasoning. You'll have then PhD level, so being able to actually contribute to human knowledge, then genius level. And then I think the challenge then is that once you've reached genius level and you give it the task of creating more intelligent versions of itself, you rapidly get to superintelligence. So there's a big difference, I think, between AGI and superintelligence. Nobody really knows whether it's going to take seconds or years to go from something that is as smart as the collective intelligence of humanity to 1,000,000 times smarter than the collective intelligence of humanity. Again, a lot of the people I know in this field would have thought that we will achieve superintelligence by 2045, 2048. The sort of feeling now is that it's going to be sooner, and so there is this thing about Daniel Kahneman and thinking fast and slow. So at the moment these models tend to be fast. You give it an input, it goes through its brain, and then it produces an output. They are now starting to build kind of internal mechanisms to reason and then make decisions. And I think one step towards sentience will be having a machine that understands itself in the world, and the decisions that it makes affects itself. Now that means you might have to embody it either in the physical world or the digital world. But I think this is going to happen a lot sooner than what we think. That's the general sentiment.
How do we prepare for that?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
If there is a startup today saying, I'm building an AGI and very reputable team researchers, will you personally invest in this startup? That's curiosity.
I think
Tough question.
well, why am I investing? To make some money, or is the world going to be around in 10 years' time? I'll invest in companies that are trying to mitigate the risks associated with the impact of these technologies. And
On that note, I believe Elon Musk just started an AI company.
he did, yeah. And
he
started the company as an antidote to, first of all, Google, because he felt that, and I'm going to paraphrase him, you can go and watch his interview, but he felt that Google were trying to create essentially solve intelligence without necessarily a regard on the impact that that will have on society. He co-founded OpenAI as an antidote to that, but of course OpenAI has become closed AI, and now he's looking at trying to create whatever, just trust GPT as an antidote to that. Yeah.
And OpenAI is, I believe their mission is to create an AGI though.
There's the handful of organizations around the world whose stated goal is to solve intelligence. Whether I think it's a good idea or not is a different matter.
What can we do to prepare for that?
I personally think that from a superintelligence perspective, when it comes along, if it sees us as a threat, it will remove us from the equation. And our goal is to figure out how to make sure that this thing doesn't see us as a threat. That's the goal.
I think there's very, yeah, I mean, I think there are, I mean, first of all, on Elon Musk, is skeptical about the purposes of his particular organization. I feel that it's very similar to this kind of ability to draw attention and hype. And that's, you know, you saw this letter, which was published by, I don't know how many folks in the field, but kind of asking for a pause in development speed on large language models, AI more generally. So I saw that and I thought, I'm a bit skeptical. I think that's just, you know, telling people, look, we've got something great, but you're not going to have it until 6 months, because the agenda was, hey, pause research for 6 months. What is on the horizon in 6 months is probably another large language model, which is going to generate revenue income for a company such as OpenAI. So I don't know too much the details of his new endeavor, but I'm skeptical. I'll leave it at that.
It wasn't his first open letter. I believe the first one was with Stephen Hawking and 1,000 other scientists back in 2015, also like cautioning.
But I think the incentives have changed. I think the incentives have changed massively since back then. I think AI has become much more commercialized. People are seeing this as almost a gold rush. So I think if you look at the individuals on that letter, there's some very well-respected researchers, and there's some, you know, folks from, you know, from industry who, you know, of course I'm from industry as well, but I kind of view that with a little bit of skepticism.
I signed both letters. I signed a letter cautioning around the use of AI in autonomous weapons. I think that was 2015. And I signed this letter, not because I thought that we would necessarily pause for 6 months, but because I think more and more people need to be aware of the impact that these technologies will have. You know, you might be skeptical about Elon Musk, and I think that's a good, healthy, but I think also that the idea was that within that 6 months, we could then have a dialogue and figure out what we should do, whether it's pause indefinitely or whatnot. It wasn't to just pause for 6 months. It was to have some time to have a dialogue about it.
It is definitely causing a gold rush, though. You mentioned that. We're seeing more. I mean, I believe Goldman Sachs recently reported that on earning calls, you're seeing a higher number of companies mentioning AI than ever before. They predict that U.S. investment in AI could reach 1% of U.S. GDP by as early as 2030. And just in 2021 alone, global private investment in AI totaled 94 billion. The US, the share was 53 billion, and that was up 5-fold from 3 years prior. Rick, the gold rush.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why I was asking you earlier.
The opportunities are in your domain.
Because from an investor perspective, you know, I have to say yes or no, both sides actually. On one side is the market is there. Like I mentioned, there's so much money flow into this sector at the moment. So if any of you are thinking about today to create a startup, please think about ChatGPT, because it's really hot topic at the moment, easier to raise money. But on the other side,
we should talk.
On the other side, like if you ask me as an investor, you know, apart from this market trending and also all those whatever you call hype or not, we are have lots of, I think, consideration or questions at the moment. Because one thing is we definitely try to avoid, you know, problem looking for, solution looking for problem, that kind of thing, which we see quite a lot of people have very strong, PhD in this field and want to apply in different sector. But does it really have a demand on that? It's something we're not quite sure. And secondly, is really unfortunately, most of the early stage VC like us, we have a timeline. So we have to think about, like, for example, AGI, does it really kind of achievable in certain period of time? And can they really give us a return? So at the moment, I would say it's really depend on the stage, depend on the type of AI startup you're creating. But generally for AGI, I think it's normally for investor who has a deep pocket, who has a really long-term vision on that. Otherwise, most of the generalists we see still have a little bit cautious on what's the timeline look like at the moment. And also trying to avoid the hype because the valuation is so expensive. We saw like 3 million ARR close like 700 million valuation in this space. So quite a lot of hype as well.
Is there a vertical that's hotter than others?
Oh, you mean the current vertical in this? Yeah. I think this vertical is quite hot at the moment. Everything like from the fundraising perspective, also from the commercial perspective, like I mentioned, we invested in a generative AI startup before, and it's quite hard actually for them to secure even the early stage POC with large enterprise. But in the last 6 months, they even pinned by large enterprise by themselves saying, hey, I want to do some POC with you to see what your product look like. So clearly there is a, the market is clearly in favor of those startups working in this space.
How are they raising are they raising in a position of strength?
You mean in terms of fundraising?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite, if you look, like you mentioned, right? So the US investor put quite a lot of money into this market, similar as in Europe and Asia as well. So there are quite a lot of investors want to put money into this space. However, like I said, I think most of the investors becoming more and more aware of what is really this AI mean, and they are looking for more clear use case and the potential growth in the long term, rather than just taking a general use case and then doesn't understand what's really going on. And also in the long term, people probably more and more looking for USP on technology rather than you just call API to build on top of a business model. I think things are getting more clear depending on the type of funding you are looking for. Relatively early stage, still lots of people putting money in, but in growth stage, people are fully aware, okay, once you got the money, you hit into a certain stage, people start reacting to see what's really the business traction. Like for example, there's a very hot company called Jasper.ai. So within 1 year, they become unicorn. The ARR increased pretty much from 0 to more than 50 million ARR, I heard, within 1 year. However, if you deep into the detail, you will notice there are lots of things interesting behind. It's just not that straightforward saying you increase the revenue. So you want to see the long-term sustainability, whether the business has really have an edge in the long term.
And if they are at early stages, which a lot of companies in the space might be, what level of traction do they need to show, if any? Because it is deep tech, there is a chicken and an egg situation.
Yeah, I mean, in general, deep tech, in general, there's a golden standard, people saying 1 million ARR for any startup moving from C to Series A. However, in reality, it's really depend on the use case and the traction, also the team. There's so many factors you need to consider. But for us, as normally from C to Series A, the critical thing for us is repeatability and scalability of your use case. Say, for example, even you have a 200K ARR, which is far away from 1 million. But if I can see there is a really long-term vision for this type of use case, and if I give you 10 million or even more money, I can see there is a big potential in this, then people still really give the money. So it's less, I personally feel it's less concern on the revenue side. So if you meet any investor who really just look at your financial metrics, rather than understanding your product technology and also the use case, that's probably the not right fit for this type of a deep tech, I would say, startup.
Does anyone want to add to that? I want to talk about some of the challenges to consider, especially from a legal, regulatory, compliance, and ethics perspective. I want to get a better understanding because there are some considerations, and we touched on some of it. But Daniel, do you have any thoughts on that?
From a generative AI perspective or generally?
Sorry?
From a generative AI perspective or generally?
Generative AI.
I've tried to be as controversial as possible during these sessions, but I'm going to say that there's no such thing as AI ethics. So I know there's a lot of people out there calling themselves AI ethicists, but ethics is the study of right and wrong. And what happens is the human beings create the intent. They say, I want to use this technology to maximize the utilization of my workforce or maximize the number of deliveries my drivers make or whatever. They have an intent that you build a technology or a solution that tries to achieve that intent. And sometimes it doesn't achieve it because it gets it wrong. Maybe it's bias, or sometimes it overachieves it and it causes harm elsewhere. That's not an ethical problem, that's a safety problem. You've designed a system that isn't behaving how you want it to behave, or you've designed a system that you haven't thought about the consequences of its behavior. The intent needs to get scrutinized from an ethics perspective and not the AI. I know there's a lot of scaremongery around AI ethics, but also the other problem is that people don't really know what AI is. So I know there's generative AI. There's people that think machine learning is AI. Actually, if you look at the definitions of AI, they're not very good. And I actually, again, have one definition of AI, but I won't bore you with that. I actually think there are 6 different flavors of application of AI that have emerged over the past 20 years. So algorithms plus compute plus data allow us to do 6 categories of interesting things. And I won't bore you with those 6 categories of interesting things, but each one of those categories requires different safety questions, governance questions, ethical questions, security questions. And if the problem is that we generally kind of collapse the complexity of AI into one ball, and then we think that it's all about transparency and explainability and auditability, and that's the only thing you have to consider. And actually, there's a load of other things you have to consider when deploying these types of technologies. And from a generative AI perspective, the concern that brands have at the moment is they're worried about when they prompt these technologies, who owns the prompt, who owns the response. If I'm a brand that trains one of these or tunes one of these brains on knowledge about all of my products and services and costs and profit models, etc., in theory, other people have access to that data. So what we're going to see over the next few years is probably the cloud providers allowing you to have your own private instance of these brains, so you can do what you want with them without worry about leaking that data. So there's a number of issues around privacy and IP and whatnot with regards to generative AI, but they're already solved from a technological perspective.
Are some of these practices being applied, Sarah?
I would first of all agree with a large part of what Daniel mentioned. If you, for those people who are building AI systems, we don't refer to it as AI, we refer to it as machine learning mostly. So I definitely agree with Daniel on that point of view. And I think the comments about AI ethics, similar kind of view there. I think it's the specificity of the language which we use around AI ethics. So I think Daniel's covered the point well. What was the question directly?
The initial question was challenges around like ethics, regulatory compliance, challenges.
Okay. So literally for every use case which we are looking at right now in terms of, can we use large language models, which we have to hit an API for, we go through our legal team. And so that is somewhat of an impediment in terms of the speed of progress. And that's because as much as the legalese within OpenAI's contract is, hey, look, you can opt out, whether you choose to believe that legalese is a separate matter. So one view, as Daniel kind of talks about, is, having a private cloud. The other view is, actually, do you not think about, having a private instance of that large language model, but integrating other technology with that large language model? So, for example, semantic databases, how do you use those data stores to actually connect to the underlying representations which you get from a large language model used on your own data? So you're not actually kind of necessarily training or fine-tuning a model with your own data, but you're just querying. But again, there is the question mark over, well, when you query with your own data.
You mentioned some terminology, fine-tuning. Can you?
Yeah. So this is really taking a large language model off the shelf. So let's say, OpenAI are very kind and they say, hey, Saurabh, have the model and you can put it on your laptop. What this means is that is a model which is being trained on the vast quantities of data they have access to. But let's say now I want to make that more adapted to my use cases. My use cases are very kind of medical in nature. So I want to take hundreds of thousands or millions of patient records, and I want to ensure that that large language model gives me responses which are more adapted to the populations which those health records correspond to. So that is really about fine-tuning, or just think about it kind of not in layman's terms, about adapting your model. So that's really what we're referring to here.
So instead of it doing one task, it can now be reapplied to do a different task.
Yeah, it's been
model.
Yeah, it's been specialized for another task. That's another way of thinking about it. Yeah,
It's done an MBA in the new thing.
Yeah, so it's got some general knowledge, and now you're putting it in London Business School, then you're trying to give it all the curriculum, and it's learning about, you know, how to pass the test. That's a fine-tuned model in terms of how to kind of pass some set of exams, for example.
Are there best practices that your design and development team adhere to?
There are, but, you know, honestly, we are kind of working on how to establish those best practices as we go. This is a fairly new area, so, you know, working with models on the scale that we're working on those models requires platforms to do rapid experimentation. So, you know, this question of confidence, how do you get to that question of confidence? An example of one thing which we're experimenting with internally is, okay, look, we've got a large language model which we want to optimize for a particular task. Let's call that task the task of kind of applying another model on top of. And that additional model allows you to identify those people in a population who are at particular risk for a particular condition. How do we ensure that that large language model and the model which works with it is robust, not to just that population, but many populations? So essentially what we're doing is we are adapting or fine-tuning multiple large language models so that eventually what you have is a collection of experts. So you've got large language models competing against each other to figure out the right answer. And through that mechanism, you're getting to some sense of uncertainty in your prediction. That's just one example of something which we are doing, which I could speak about at a fairly abstract level.
Okay.
One of the things that these things can be used for is actually responsible AI. So what you can do is you can build a brain trained on a legal framework or a culture or a political party or a fringe group or whatever, and you can then show content to those brains to see how they react. So you can say, WPP creates, you know, a quarter of the world's content. Obviously, there are audiences that we want to show that content to see how they react. Will they, you know, click on this link? Will they buy this product? But you also want to make sure that you're not infringing any social norms, or you're not offending any groups or breaking any laws. So you have these brains, these responsible AI brains, you can now show content to, and they can hold you to account.
So they become agents.
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole load of kind of perspectives you care not to infringe or offend.
And Lee, are there any considerations to take in from an ethical or compliance perspective if we're looking at it from an HR or future work?
Yeah, so I think there's everything that kind of these guys have talked about, but kind of applying it to within organizations of, okay, if we're going to deploy this on our own data or our employees' data, is it compliant from a GDPR perspective? Is it, you know, do we have a private instance of it? To use that example, I would actually ask this group of I'm curious about what you think about the roles of regulators in this, because we kind of haven't touched on that. And I think that's kind of fascinating given where you guys are coming from. Because a lot of these questions, it's isn't the role of governments to, if we want to pause development of AGI, isn't that the role of governments to do that? I
just came from the House of Lords, actually, meeting Tim Clement Jones, the meeting before this one, talking about the importance of regulating now. And yes, so, and again, Elon Musk, sorry to keep mentioning him, but he's just forefront of my mind at the moment, but he says, you know, he's built products in automotive, in space. Each industry where they have technology that impacts people's lives materially is regulated, and these technologies can impact people's lives materially, and so they should be regulated. What those regulations should be is the million-dollar question. Because again, my concern is that governments are not being advised by the right people. They don't quite understand what these technologies are. They don't understand necessarily the power of them. That's my biggest worry.
I would be pro-regulation. Coming from a policy background, I think we do need some parameters in place and to ensure that we minimize any harmful effects that we might foresee in the future. And I think there's also a lot of unknowns. So I think right now we do need to collaborate and form some level of collaboration and consensus sooner rather than later. So I would be in the Musk category. Does anyone want to reveal which category they might be in?
I'm in favor of regulation. However, I think the point is you do need people who have some deep expertise in these technologies to be critical voices within that regulatory space. So we see regulation from a kind of device regulation perspective, from a clinical safety perspective. So we kind of face these challenges kind of on a daily basis. So very much kind of live that world. So you see the pros and cons of it, and I think the pros are definitely, look, you're not guaranteeing, but you are ensuring that you're following the kind of principles and practices which have been defined, and that gives some level of confidence to, and from a commercial perspective, that's also important. It gives some level of confidence to partners who want to integrate with your technology. But I guess it's for those folks who are building the technology, who are kind of excited by the proof of concept stage. You see the tremendous potential, and this is not really a regulatory kind of conundrum here, but there's so much excitement about what technology can do. You want to see it in the hands of people, but of course there's that barrier in order to regulate it and to get it kind of signed off and so forth. So, we internally have mechanisms for that. For example, not everything we do, but one of the product areas which we work on is products for clinicians. So clinicians can oversee the outputs of these AIs. They can kind of verify, look, that looks correct, that doesn't look correct. So that's a kind of feedback loop which we kind of get to benefit from. But the barrier to releasing products which are driven by, let's say, generative AI for a consumer is much higher. And so there's Babylon has been at the receiving end of people scrutinizing its technology in public spaces. So we live that every day.
Okay, and you seems like you have that human intervention in place to ensure that reliability of the data, that those sort of challenges are minimized in some respect. Anyone else wants to add on to that before we move on? Well, I think we talked about the importance of generative AI, and this is a quote from the Google CEO just back in 2018, actually, at the World Economic Forum. He talked about how important it is. It's probably the most important thing humanity has ever worked on. I think of it as something more profound than electricity. We are at that junction. I want to ask you, what do you think the future will look like?
I think that we don't know what the future looks like, but I think it's within all our gift to create it. And one of the reasons why I do these things is to try to educate people as much as possible about the importance of making good decisions using these technologies. It's within our gift to create the future. And I believe it's everybody's responsibility. Either you're making decisions or you're holding people at account who make decisions. And I think we need to raise the consciousness of everybody around these technologies so we collectively make better decisions.
Yes, well, very well put. I don't want to piggyback on that answer, but one thing I would say is that I think it's everybody's responsibility to get educated on these technologies. But I think beyond that, and it's kind of related to the kind of future of work kind of stream, it's not just get educated about these technologies, but try and immerse yourself in how to use these technologies so that you can understand where they're good and where they have their downsides. If you know their downsides, then you can ask those critical questions. So again, I'm no kind of foreseer or predictor of the future, but because this future is moving so fast, even in the last couple of weeks, this field has moved on in leaps and bounds, and there's tremendous excitement. And I'm, just happy that, I get to work in this space. And I think for those of you thinking about starting companies in this space, there is so much opportunity here. It used to be that code won. In other words, it would be, you need large engineering teams to put ideas in production. Now I think ideas win. So I think it's, have those ideas. And now with technologies such as generative AI, you can actually reduce the scale of the team which you previously would have needed to put those ideas into production. And so that's what I would say. It is profound. It's exciting, but I think, get involved, understand the nuance rather than just being told, hey, generative AI is, X number of years away from delivering AGI. What does it actually mean to have a generative AI model? How does that fit within the whole kind of, sphere of AGI? So I think that's what I would kind of encourage.
Yeah. Like picking on a couple of points, I really like what Daniel said earlier about the, right, if this works, we all get to work less, right? So let's say kind of a 3-day work week in, 5-10 years time, right? And then we have transformed city centers because people have free time, so they do more stuff in the communities. They, spend more time looking after their purpose. We have governments that react to this so that we have large scale upskilling, transfer of work, like a flow from skills to work. We have like an abundance of creativity as a society. And that abundance of creativity can be put towards, the green revolution, the bio revolution, and we actually create jobs in the spheres that we need it. That would maybe be a view of the world. That would be very nice. So I've taken the glass half full view.
Rick?
I think it's quite hard for me to estimate what's going to happen on the AI side. But one thing I do see is if you look back the past 5 years, consumer fintech are dominant the market. If you're working on that kind of industry, you're the best. And last 2 years, because of COVID, biotech is so booming. And now it's AI. So it's quite hard to say. I think I believe it's quite estimate what's really going on for each individual industry. But one thing you can generally see is deep tech, fundamental scientific breakthrough is getting more and more attention in the market. So this is definitely a more trending. We have seen from the investment perspective. So less probably on the application layer, but more on fundamental science or those kind of like really true innovation that's going potentially to dominate the industry. So if you're really looking for the future or asking me what I think in the long term, I think scientific breakthrough or anything related to innovation at the fundamental layer is probably more have a bright future in your view.
On that note, we're going to go to a Q&A. We want to hear from you. If you're in the room and you want to ask a question using slido.com, just go in there and put in our code, all in tech. We also have 2 roaming mics. If you want to stand up and you want to ask your question. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, we'll just make sure you have the mic.
So I'm curious how you guys all feel as leaders in the industry. Politically, we didn't really talk politically at all, but I love the glass half full perspective from both of you guys, and we didn't talk about it too much in the middle here, but how do we make sure that people, sorry, I'm trying to phrase it right here. A lot of this is about taking over jobs in the industry. And so how do you guys within your organizations, but also how do we make sure that the government is going to make sure that works out correctly for the people? I mean, in America, it's like I think about, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase it. We don't want to give out a lot of money in America. So how, it seems, I'm in the Republican Party, how do we make sure that people are living their best lives if the industry does take over and does take a lot of jobs from people? And I mean, yeah, and how do you guys phrase that to your people in your business? And how do you keep that positive, and how do you keep that as a positive idea going forward?
So I'd encourage everybody to read the books by Callum Chase. Again, he's a good friend of mine who's been writing about this stuff for a long, long time. And so the purpose of my company, and I believe, hopeful, that it's the collective purpose of enterprise they'll actually make the future better. So anyway, but the purpose of my company is to enable everybody to live beyond themselves. There are too many people born on this planet that have unbelievable economic constraints. And the question is, how do you unlock those people to be able to live for others? And you can either try to tax rich people and distribute it using things like UBI, but I don't think there's been any convincing model to be able to demonstrate that that's going to work. Or you can try and bring the cost of goods down. And that's what my company has been doing for a long time. We've been removing the friction from the creation and dissemination of goods. We've been trying to reinvent how workforces operate so that you can then allocate people more granularly, so that if people are displaced in their work, they can have a portfolio career. And I thought that we had 20 years to solve that problem. Now I don't know about that. So I think you're right. It is up to the government to figure out how do you mitigate the risk of social unrest if there is mass technological employment. And I don't think anybody knows the answer, which is why I'm hopeful that collectively we all solve that problem.
There are some in terms of like automation, Germany's actually done a pretty good job of having like a collective of some of the larger organizations kind of basically create a two-sided platform to mix where jobs go, right? Like railway workers get made redundant, but they could work in car manufacturing. Like I think there are models which work, it just needs like dedicated time and effort to do that. That's the best example that kind of I can think of. I think technology actually will help us get to a better flow of skills to work. I think there has to be a bit of an appetite to do it, but we also see the ill effects of mass layoffs in in places in the US that now have kind of pretty significant like opioid issues coming from a lack of anything. So there's definitely kind of a very significant acute issue coming up. I think the pacing of the automation is actually really important, and the pacing of the like moving different disciplines on. And I think these guys will correct me if I'm wrong, but so far the like productivity gains from using this technology have seemed to be like the less skilled, right? So it turns like an okay project manager into a really good project manager. It doesn't turn a really good project manager into like it's not the similar sort of gain. So I think like, is there a democratization on that element of it, which I think is also.
I would agree. I think there's going to be different phases. In the beginning, it's going to augment or help you perform better at your job, which is productivity gains. And then as we progress with technology, I think there's a lot of unknowns because right now we don't even know the adoption rate. And we can use past data, historical data, to look at, okay, where we're looking at the bigger innovations that have happened in the past that have had a huge impact. Like, what was the impact on jobs? And then how did we recover? Based on historical data, it's optimistic. A lot of jobs will be lost, but will be rehoused. But that's, again, an assumption. There's a lot of assumptions pertaining to that. I think there's a lot of unknowns. I'm going to move on to the next question.
Sorry, I just want to say that I think that you used that right word there, I think, which was adoption. I think that adoption takes longer than what we think. We work with companies. It takes several years to really start to adopt these technologies. The investment cycles take a certain amount of time. Academia have their own cycles. So I think 10 years, we will see lots of exciting things going on. I think beyond that, it's hard to say. But I think we will always want to work, even if it is not paid work. I still want to play chess and play the drums, apparently. That's work, right? I don't get paid for it, but I think we will all want to work.
Okay, I have a question. Who is accountable for AI systems when they fail?
So there's interesting ethical. So you've heard of the trolley problem, which is if you're in your driverless car, in front of you is a kid, to the right, two adults, to the left is a cliff. Who does the car kill? The kid, the two adults, or you? I think the question is is that the car deciding? I think in the future, I'm going to get future now, is that you will have a digital avatar, a digital representation of you, a mini brain, a language model that represents you, that's trained on all of you and your data, and it will be driving the car. So if you prefer to kill grandmas over cats, then the car will do that. So I think you're going to end up having a thing that represents you making decisions, and that's actually where the accountability will stop, so that it prevents the car manufacturers being accountable for making that decision. But between now and then, I don't know.
Okay. Any questions for anyone in the room?
Hello. Thank you very much for excellent discussion. I work in healthcare and focusing on the phase 3, phase 4 research, clinical research. So I want to know that from your vision, could you please share your vision on healthcare in 10 years on the clinical side? And my second question is, if we can, using AI to convey clinical research, is it possible to make it more accurate and also can cut down budget using artificial intelligence? Thank you.
I guess I should say that.
Being the healthcare person. So in the kind of medical research space in phase 3 and phase 4, so I come from a healthcare background as well as working in healthcare, worked in healthcare for 15, 20 years, background in genomics, drug design, and later pandemic modeling. So kind of broad kind of disciplines in healthcare. So where I would be most excited about, I'm not sure if it's directly answering your question, but it will give you a view towards a kind of a view of the future, is this kind of integration of what we always expected going back 20, 30 years ago with big projects such as the Human Genome Project. So full genomic sequencing, proteomic sequencing, metabolomic sequencing to understand the interaction of, the central dogma, which is DNA, protein, and kind of interaction within the cell. So just as we've done with, projects such as AlphaFold, which have given us protein structure predictions. Actually, I worked on that going back 15 years ago. And actually back then we thought that that's a almost impossible task. And, probably 2 years ago now, the team at DeepMind went and kind of solved that with incredibly high accuracy. Where I think, where I would like to see it go is actually, look, protein structure prediction is one thing, but then how do you model the interaction of a particular molecule within its environment? So you can represent a particular molecule using a large language model. You can create predictions from it to give you the structure, but then how do you model a system or the environments around it to figure out how that molecule interacts with that environment? So that's an area which I think we are increasingly going down. So Daniel's kind of mentioned this concept of digital twins. It's a very abstract kind of concept. You can apply it to different industries, but think about a twin of a cell and think about the interactions of what you know from the genomic context, the proteomic context, and how that interaction works within the molecules within the wider cell. So that's a kind of very narrow answer in terms of research and how we may get benefits. And you had a second part to your question, which I don't remember now.
How can we increase the clinical research? How can we use AI to increase the accuracy of the clinical research going onwards?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very relevant question. I think there's kind of multiple aspects to that. There is increasing the efficiency of researchers themselves. So, for anyone who's done research or a PhD in kind of a discipline where you have to trawl through masses of papers, there are kind of simple examples here of, well, how can we, better understand, given multimodal large language models, how could we pump in one of those papers into this type of system and ask it to reason not just over text, but to reason over images, graphs, and so forth to kind of summarize those results. So that's a glimpse of how you can increasingly kind of automate and kind of deliver more efficiency in the overall research process. So
next question I'll take from someone online. What would be the best use case for HR tech? Rick, Lee, I'll let you kick off if you want.
HR tech?
Yes.
I think there's like immediate term and then kind of longer term. I think immediate term, the kind of use cases that jump to mind, recruiting, I think, is an obvious one, especially large organizations hiring loads and loads of people, kind of CV screening, scanning, are we getting the right skills and everything else. then I think there's the learning and development space, right? If we can kind of generate training videos or generate the best content for which you learn by as an individual, how do we quickly kind of upskill people and get people to productivity as quickly as possible? And I think that saves a lot of time and money. The review cycle of how we give each other feedback, learn from that feedback, it's super variable at the moment. It happens kind of once or twice a year. It's not kind of live direct, and the advice you get may not be kind of founded in academic literature of how to change behavior, so kind of behavior change part of it. And I think there's like a combination of all those things in the longer term, right? So one of EQT's investments is in Beamery, where they're kind of trying to put that all together. But it's kind of like, I need a really good project manager. And they're like, okay, well, you probably want someone who has these skills, but actually these 3 skills are proven to thrive in your organization. So we need those skills. Those skills are available in these 3 cities. Those people tend to hang out at these universities. They like to be communicated to in this way. Here's a job description, and we've set up 4 interviews for, like, just automating that whole process is kind of really, really interesting. I think HR has a similar sort of thing to the like on-premise in the cloud challenge of like, it is super regulatory, super compliance based, and pretty like underinvested in. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I think the rate of adoption will be pretty slow still. Like, it's very, very exciting. I speak to my colleagues or other people that are in and around this space, and I'm like, holy shit, this thing just wrote me like a 3-day workshop in 10 seconds and provided me all the content and talking points for all different things. And everyone's like, oh, I haven't really looked at it. And that's like pretty much it. So I think there's like, HR is where finance was 30 years ago in terms of the investment in it. So I think it's there's a huge amount of white space. I think the adoption might be kind of slow.
Okay. Lee, anything to add on that? Anything to add on that? No. Okay. We're going to take one last question from the audience.
Yeah, hello.
Could we, sorry, there's 2. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good evening. So my question is actually in 2 different branches. One is technical, one is like business side. So when we talk about AI and generative AI, so in technical side, mostly B2B companies are getting benefited right now. Mostly the business model for them are working right now. So is there, like, I know Saurav is already working in something like health domain. So is there other applied domains where like common social entrepreneurship could work? That is one of my question, apart from health, and how it can be a proper business model. And second, the business side question is basically that, are the capitalists and investors interested in investing some social entrepreneurship in terms of AI?
Which question do you want answered?
The first one, technical side will be.
Second? Sorry?
First.
Pick one.
Okay.
First one? Okay, first question. Repeat your technical question.
It says like mostly B2B companies are getting benefited right now because you see like the data and the generation of even the generative AI is like company sells to the other companies, like, but for common people, like how is it getting more beneficial? So the applied part question is like which domains should we go into and apply these things so that it could be more beneficial to common people?
Okay, so it's more about application.
Or maybe I'll be adding some points.
This is actually a $1 billion question. You know, if you figure out, you can just apply to that domain successfully. I think in my view, but you guys probably know this better than me in specific domain, I do see quite a lot of B2C application, actually use case at the beginning. On the B2B, it's just getting there. People start using, like I mentioned, large enterprise start thinking about that. But actually the beginning, it's actually mainly on the B2C side. That's my straightforward, you know, what I see in the industry. On the B2B, I think people just start getting some use case, but still not truly clear what's the advantage of using them. That's what I thought on the business side, I would say.
I spent a lot of time thinking about opportunities for B2C.
Objective question. So basically, most investment goes into B2B side or B2C side? Just objective question.
I think at the moment, probably more B2C a little bit, but most of them, for example, is combined with B2B as well. Because so what happened is at the beginning, it's much easier for B2C to adopt, this new technology. But later, a large enterprise, whatever business side, they start thinking about that, then they are actually getting used to it. But definitely, Daniel, probably want to add to that.
I know we have a lot of questions. We need to wrap up. There's quite a lot of questions online as well. What we can do is you can actually go to our Slack channel or send us your questions on Slido. We'll make sure that we pass them to the speakers. And if they get a response, we will circulate that. On that note, I want to thank the speakers. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a very engaging and informative conversation. I know we covered quite a lot. I want to thank the audience. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you for your enthusiasm. And I want to thank the London Business School Healthcare Club. Without this, Varuni and Fran, this wouldn't have come together. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming here tonight. You can continue to mingle, but otherwise, good night.
Thank you.